On the 22nd of May, 1885, the body of Victor Hugo lay in state beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, the greatest monument in France, built to honor the armies of Napoleon, draped in black for a man who had never commanded a single soldier. 2 million people came. They walked through the streets of Paris through the night and into the morning. Workers and senators, schoolchildren and philosophers, people who had never read a word he wrote, and people who had read every word twice. The procession to the Panthéon stretched for miles. It was the largest public gathering in French history to that point, and by most accounts, the most genuinely felt. Victor Hugo had wanted this. He had wanted it with a clarity and a patience that most men reserve for things they are not certain they will receive. He had spent his entire adult life constructing not just a body of work, but a position, a meaning, a place in the permanent record of civilization. And on that May morning in 1885, it was clear that he had succeeded beyond almost any measure available. This is the story of Victor Hugo. He was the author of Les Misérables, the novel that had made Jean Valjean and Inspector Javert and Fantine into figures that readers across the world recognized as though they were real. He was the author of Notre Dame de Paris, the book that had saved the Gothic architecture of France by making people fall in love with it. He was the poet of Les Contemplations, the playwright of Hernani, the political exile who had refused to return to France until liberty returned with him. He was, by every public measurement, the conscience of a nation. And then there is the other story. The story that the 2 million people in the streets could not have told you, because most of them did not know it. The story of the man behind the monument, the private Victor Hugo, who kept notebooks that his literary executors found deeply uncomfortable, who pursued women throughout a 50-year relationship with the person who loved him most completely, who learned of his daughter's death by reading a stranger's newspaper at a café table while traveling with his mistress, and who did not rush home, who preached mercy in every novel he ever wrote and dispensed it, in his private life, with a selectivity that the novels themselves would not have recognized as grace. This is the question the documentary will spend its time answering, not who Victor Hugo was in the streets of Paris on the day of his funeral, but who he was in the rooms where nobody was watching, and whether those two men, the public prophet and the private person, were at war with each other, or whether they were, in some way we are still trying to understand, the same man all along. 2 million people mourned him, but the woman who had loved him for 50 years had been dead for 2 years already, and the daughter whose loss had cracked him open and made his greatest work possible had been dead for 42 years. The story of Victor Hugo, the real one, begins long before the crowds. It begins in a world that was already violently remaking itself. Before we continue, if you find yourself drawn to documentaries that go beneath the public surface of great lives, into the private contradictions and the human costs behind the celebrated names, then subscribe to The Long Shadow. It helps this channel reach more thoughtful viewers, and I am genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from tonight? To understand what shaped Victor Hugo, you have to understand what France was in the first years of the 19th century, because France in 1802 was not a stable country with a clear identity. It was a country that had just spent a decade tearing itself apart and was now watching a single man attempt to put it back together through sheer force of personality and military genius. 13 years before Hugo's birth, the French Revolution had dismantled an entire world, the monarchy gone, the aristocracy scattered, the church stripped of its authority. The old social order, which had organized French life for centuries, had been demolished with a speed and a violence that stunned the rest of Europe and left France itself unsure of what it had become. What followed was not peace. It was the Terror, and then the Directory, and then the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who by 1800 had made himself first consul, and by 1804 would make himself emperor. He was, depending on your position, either the savior of the revolution's ideals or the man who had betrayed them for personal ambition. Both were true, which was part of why he was so difficult to look away from. The France that Victor Hugo was born into was Napoleon's France, a country of extraordinary energy and profound contradiction. A country that had declared the rights of man and was simultaneously building an empire on military conquest. A country where careers were open to talent, where a Corsican officer's son could become emperor, but where the gap between the celebrated few and the suffering many remained vast and largely unexamined. This tension between the grand proclamation and the lived reality, between the rhetoric of liberty and the fact of poverty, would become the central preoccupation of Hugo's life. Not because he was born poor, he was not, but because he was born into a world where the gap was visible, where it announced itself every day in the streets of whatever city his father's military postings dragged the family to next. The literary world Hugo entered as a young man was equally unsettled. France had a literary tradition of enormous prestige and considerable rigidity. The classical rules governing what poetry and theatre could do, what language was acceptable, what subjects were worthy, had been in place for 2 centuries. They were not rules that welcomed disruption. And Victor Hugo, from the very beginning, was disruption. The world he was born into made that almost inevitable. A country that had just shattered its own past had created the conditions for a literature that would shatter its own past as well. Hugo would not simply be a great writer in the French tradition. He would be the writer who remade what that tradition was allowed to be. That story was still decades away when he arrived, but the ground had already been prepared. Victor Marie Hugo was born on the 26th of February 1802 in Besançon in eastern France, the third son of a general and a royalist, which is to say, he was born into a household at war with itself before he could speak. His father, Joseph Léopold Sigisbert Hugo, was a man of genuine military ability and considerable personal ambition. He had risen through the ranks of Napoleon's army on the strength of his competence and his loyalty, and he would eventually reach the rank of general. He was also frequently absent. The nature of Napoleon's campaigns meant that a soldier with Leopold's rank was rarely in one place for long, and so the Hugo household moved. Besançon, to Elba, to Corsica, to Paris, to Avellino in Italy. Later, most significantly, to Madrid, where Leopold served under Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, who had been installed as King of Spain. Victor was a child of these journeys. He would later draw on the memory of Spain, its landscapes, its scale, its dramatic contrasts of poverty and grandeur. For the rest of his life, he would carry a visual imagination shaped partly by those early years of movement. His mother, Sophie Trebuchet, was the fixed point in this itinerant life. A woman of strong convictions and stronger opinions, Sophie was a committed royalist who had no sympathy for everything her husband served. She had her own life in Paris when Leopold was away, her own friendships, her own political sympathies, and eventually her own affair. With General Victor Lahorie, an old friend of the family who had become involved in royalist conspiracies against Napoleon, and who was the man after whom Victor Hugo had been named. This is the surprising detail that the standard biography tends to soften. Victor Hugo was named for a man who was almost certainly his mother's lover, and who was, for a time, hiding in the Hugo family home to escape arrest. General Lahorie was eventually captured and executed in 1812. Victor was 10 years old. What does it do to a child to grow up between parents whose entire worldview is in opposition? To have a father who represents the Napoleonic order and a mother who shelters the men working against it? To have your own name come from that divided loyalty? It produces, in some people, a profound uncertainty about where they stand. In Victor Hugo, it seems to have produced something different. a determination to stand everywhere, to be large enough to contain the contradiction rather than resolve it. His politics throughout his life would shift repeatedly, from royalism to liberalism to republicanism, and his admirers would call it growth, while his critics called it opportunism. The truth was probably that he had been trained from birth to hold opposing things simultaneously and call it not confusion, but complexity. He was a child who read voraciously, who wrote early, who absorbed everything around him with an intensity that his mother recognized and encouraged. When the family eventually separated formally, Victor went to Paris to live with Sophie. He was educated at home and in small schools. He was slight, serious, and already, by his early adolescence, unmistakably hungry for something larger than the life around him. His father was a general who rarely came home. His mother was a woman who spent years fighting a war her husband had already chosen a side in. Victor Hugo grew up in the gap between them and would spend his entire life trying to fill it with words. In a notebook that has survived from his early adolescence, Victor Hugo wrote a line that his biographers have been quoting ever since. He wrote that he wanted to be Chateaubriand, or nothing. François-René de Chateaubriand was the dominant figure of French letters in the early 19th century, a writer of enormous stylistic prestige, deeply associated with the romantic sensibility that was beginning to reshape European literature. To want to be Chateaubriand at 15 was an enormous ambition, but the line is interesting for another reason. It already contained the characteristic Hugo move, the refusal of the middle ground. Chateaubriand or nothing, not simply a writer, not a good writer, the defining one. What drove this was not simple vanity, though vanity was certainly present. It was something closer to a vocation. Hugo genuinely believed, from very early in his life, that he had been placed in the world to do something permanent, to produce work that would outlast him in the way that Homer's work had outlasted Homer, in the way that Virgil and Dante had outlasted their centuries. He wanted to be, in the most literal sense, immortal through language. This is an unusual ambition to carry at 15. It is an even more unusual one to carry consistently for the next 70 years, never quite releasing it, never fully doubting it. Most people who want great things learn, eventually, to modulate the wanting. Hugo never did. He was a child of remarkable precocity. His early poetry exercises, done for school competitions, displayed a technical command that astonished his teachers. He absorbed classical forms and romantic influences simultaneously, turning them over in his mind and producing work that already had his fingerprints on it. Clarity of image, emotional directness, a sense of scale that kept pressing against whatever form it was trying to inhabit. He won his first prize from the prestigious Académie des Jeux Floraux in Toulouse at 14. He won it again at 15 and again at 16. By the time he was 17, the Académie Française had recognized him with a special distinction. These were not encouragements. These were confirmations of something he already knew. But the ambition had a cost that would not become fully visible for years. A person who has decided, at 15, that he is destined for permanent greatness is a person who has already, in some sense, organized his interior life around his own legacy. The relationship with other people, the ordinary human commerce of love and reciprocity and vulnerability, tends to occupy a secondary position in that arrangement. Not because such a person cannot feel. Hugo felt intensely, but his feelings were processed through the machinery of a self already oriented toward its own importance. Love, grief, friendship, politics, all of it would eventually become material, fuel for the work. The work was the point. He was 17 years old, winning prizes and writing verse at a speed that impressed everyone around him, and already the distance between the extraordinary boy and the people who loved him was being established. It would widen steadily for the next 7 decades. He was 15 years old, and already certain of his greatness. The question was not whether the world would recognize him. The question, the one he never quite asked himself clearly enough, was what he would have to become to be recognized on the terms he had chosen. Victor Hugo married Adèle Fouché on the 12th of October 1822. He was 20 years old, she was 21. They had known each other since childhood. Their families were connected. Their early friendship had deepened into something that Hugo described in letters with an ardor that was entirely genuine. He loved her. The letters from this period are not the letters of a young man performing emotion for effect. They are the letters of someone genuinely overwhelmed by feeling and by the fear of losing it. His mother Sophie had opposed the match. She died in June of 1821, before the marriage took place, which meant that the final obstacle removed itself, though the timing gave Hugo's early married life a slightly complicated emotional texture. He had wanted both things, his mother's approval and his marriage, and had ended up with neither her blessing nor her living presence. The first years were, by most accounts, genuinely happy. Hugo was prolific and celebrated. His first published collection of poetry, Odes et Poésies diverses, appeared in 1822, the same year he married, and received enough attention that Louis XVIII awarded him a royal pension. He was 20 years old, newly married, and already receiving royal recognition. The trajectory seemed entirely clear. Adèle was not a passive figure in these early years. She was intelligent and warm, a woman who took their domestic life seriously and who engaged genuinely with Hugo's work. They had 5 children together between 1823 and 1835. Their first child, a son named Leopold, died in infancy in 1823. Their eldest surviving daughter was Leopoldine, born in 1824. Then Charles, François Victor, and the youngest daughter Adèle, born in 1830, who would later carry a different kind of shadow through the story. But something was already shifting beneath the surface of the marriage. Hugo's literary ambitions were pulling him outward, into salons and literary circles and the emerging battles of the Romantic movement. And in those circles, he encountered Charles-Augustin Sainte-Beuve. Sainte-Beuve was one of the most significant literary critics of the period. He was also Hugo's close friend, and he was, beginning somewhere in the late 1820s, conducting an affair with Adèle. The precise timeline remains historically uncertain. What is not uncertain is that Hugo knew or suspected, and that his response was to work harder, to publish more, to push further into the public arena rather than confront what was happening in his private one. Whether this was avoidance or pride, or simply the behavior of a man who had always prioritized the work, is a question the record leaves genuinely open. What is clear is that by the early 1830s, the interior architecture of the Hugo marriage had already been compromised. The household continued to function, the children were raised, the famous literary dinners continued, but the intimacy that had characterized the early years was not recovered. He had won the prizes he wanted, married the girl he loved, and set himself on the path to literary greatness. Everything was in place, and Sainte-Beuve had already begun visiting more often than was strictly necessary. In 1827, Victor Hugo published a preface. Ostensibly, it was the preface to a new verse drama he had written about Oliver Cromwell, the 17th-century English revolutionary. The play itself was never performed. It was far too long, architecturally peculiar, and probably unperformable on any practical stage. But the preface was something else entirely. The Cromwell preface was a manifesto, a declaration of war against 2 centuries of French classical literary doctrine, written with the confidence of a man who believed he was announcing the future. Classical French literature, in the tradition running from Racine through the 18th century, operated according to strict principles, the 3 unities: time, place, action. The separation of genres, Comedy here, tragedy there, never in the same work. The hierarchy of subjects, noble themes for serious art, low subjects for lesser forms, and perhaps most significantly, a doctrine of what language was acceptable, elevated diction for elevated subjects, no mixing, no contamination. Hugo read all of this as a prison, and in the Cromwell preface, he broke the walls down with considerable precision. His central argument was this: life does not separate the tragic from the comic. The sublime and the grotesque coexist in all human experience. A great funeral can contain an inappropriate laugh. A moment of terror can produce absurdity. A beautiful person can be destroyed by something ugly and small. Literature that refuses to acknowledge this is not elevated. It is simply incomplete. He called this the principle of the grotesque and the sublime together, and he illustrated it through the history of world literature, from ancient drama through Shakespeare, arguing that the greatest works had always contained both registers simultaneously. It was only the particular rigidity of the French tradition that had tried to force them apart. This was not just an aesthetic argument, it was a philosophical one. Hugo was saying that truth required complexity, that a literature capable only of the beautiful was a literature that could not honestly represent what it meant to be human. He was 25 years old when he wrote it. The reception from the literary establishment was predictably hostile. Critics who had built their careers on the classical tradition recognized exactly what Hugo was doing and objected strenuously. But for an entire generation of young writers and artists, the preface landed like a door being opened into a room they had been pressing against for years. Théophile Gautier would describe reading it as one of the formative experiences of his life. Eugène Delacroix, Hector Berlioz, Alfred de Vigny, they were all circling the same instinct from different artistic directions. Hugo had given that instinct a theoretical foundation and a rallying point. He had not merely written a preface, he had organized a movement, and he had done it with the characteristic Hugo combination of genuine intellectual insight and perfect self-positioning. The Romantic movement would have emerged without him, but it would not have had a leader, and Hugo understood, from the beginning, that movements need leaders the way armies need generals. He had conquered French literary theory. Now he needed a stage. On the 25th of February 1830, the Comédie Française in Paris opened its doors for the premiere of a new verse drama by Victor Hugo. The play was called Hernani, and what followed was not simply a theatrical evening, it was a battle. Hugo had organized it that way deliberately. He understood that the Cromwell preface had established the theoretical argument for Romanticism, but that theory alone would not break the classical hold on French cultural life. What was needed was a public confrontation, a moment sufficiently visible and sufficiently dramatic that it could not be ignored or qualified away. He distributed free tickets, printed on red cardstock, to several hundred young romantics, artists, poets, painters, writers. Théophile Gautier came in a scarlet waistcoat that became one of the most famous articles of clothing in French literary history. He was 19 years old. Honoré de Balzac was there, Alfred de Vigny, Gérard de Nerval. The gathering was a generation's worth of talent packed into the theatre stalls with explicit instructions to applaud and to fight back against whatever the classicists threw at them. The classicists had also organized. They came prepared to boo, to hiss, to shout down anything that violated the rules they believed the stage existed to protect. And Hernani gave them material. The play opened with a line that violated classical verse doctrine in its very first syllable. Hugo had done that on purpose too. What followed was chaos spread over multiple performances. The audience brawled. Critics published furious denunciations. Hugo's supporters returned night after night to defend the production. The newspapers covered the controversy with the intensity usually reserved for political events, because in France in 1830, this essentially was a political event. The battle over what literature was allowed to do was also a battle over what kind of society France was becoming. Hernani ran for 37 performances. By any commercial measure, it was a success. By any cultural measure, it was a turning point. French Romanticism had won the stage. But this section of Hugo's story deserves a pause, because the Battle of Hernani, as it became known, was also the moment when the relationship between Hugo and his public began to take on a quality that would define the rest of his life. He was not simply a writer who had achieved recognition. He was a figure, a standard around which people organized themselves. And that kind of position, once established, becomes its own demand. To remain the leader of a movement, you must continue to move. You cannot consolidate, cannot pause, cannot turn inward. Every silence is read as retreat. Every personal uncertainty is politically inconvenient. And so Hugo, from 1830 onward, was a man pressed from both sides by the ambition that drove him toward perpetual public achievement and by the private life that was, quietly, beginning to collapse. He had conquered the theatre. The critics had been routed. He was 28 years old and the most talked-about writer in France. And at home, Adele was increasingly alone. In 1831, Victor Hugo published Notre Dame de Paris. In English, the book would eventually become known as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, though that title is a later translator's choice that Hugo himself never used and would probably have resisted. He named it for the cathedral, not the character. That distinction matters enormously. Hugo wrote the book partly out of love for Gothic architecture and partly out of rage at what was happening to it. France in the 1820s and 30s was in the process of demolishing, modifying, or simply neglecting some of the finest medieval buildings in Europe. The Cathedral of Notre Dame itself was in a state of considerable disrepair. Hugo had watched this happening and had found himself unable to write an architectural argument persuasive enough to change it, so he wrote a novel instead. His calculation was correct. Notre Dame de Paris became one of the most widely read novels in France within months of publication, and within a few years the cathedral had become a national obsession rather than a national embarrassment. The restoration campaign that eventually transformed Notre Dame, led by the architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc beginning in 1844, can be traced in a direct line back to Hugo's novel, creating a public that suddenly cared. A work of literature changed the physical shape of a building that still stands today. That is not a common thing. But the novel's deeper importance lies not in architectural advocacy, but in what Hugo discovered he could do with a character who was genuinely, grotesquely, physically deformed. Quasimodo, the bell ringer of Notre Dame, was deaf, nearly blind in one eye, hunchbacked, and by the visual standards of his world, a monster. He was also, in the novel, the character most capable of genuine love, most capable of self-sacrifice, most capable of the kind of feeling that the beautiful, socially integrated characters around him could not sustain. Hugo was working out, in fiction, what he would spend the rest of his life arguing in various forms, that the condemned, the excluded, the physically or socially marked, were not inferior to the people who condemned them. They were frequently more fully human. The society that pushed them to its margins was not protecting its best values. It was betraying them. Quasimodo was the first of Hugo's great characters in this line. Jean Valjean would be the last and most fully realized. But they shared the same essential structure, a person society had decided to discard, who contained within himself a capacity for grace that the discarding society had forfeited. The irony embedded in this, which would not become fully legible for many years, is that Hugo understood this kind of loneliness from the inside, not the physical kind, not the poverty or the imprisonment, but the isolation of a person whose interior life does not match the face they present to the world. The man who wrote Quasimodo understood something about living at a distance from the people around him, even when surrounded by them. He just never said so directly. He said it through his characters instead, and perhaps that was the point. He had written a monster who was more human than any of the beautiful people surrounding him. The irony, which would only become clear much later, was that Hugo understood that kind of loneliness in ways that his public life made very difficult to admit. In 1833, Hugo was working on a new play called Lucrece Borgia. For the role of the Princess Negroni, he cast a young actress named Juliette Drouet. She had not had a major theatrical career. She was known more for her beauty than for her performances. The role was not large. What happened between them in the weeks of rehearsal and production is not fully documented. What is known is that by the time Lucrece Borgia opened in February of 1833, they were involved, and that the involvement did not end. It continued, in various forms, through every change of circumstance that Hugo's life would bring, through exile, through political upheaval, through the deaths of people they both knew, until Juliette's own death 50 years later in 1883. Juliette Drouet was not a simple person. She was intelligent, deeply literate, emotionally complex, and possessed of a quality that is hard to name precisely, but that comes through clearly in the more than 20,000 letters she wrote to Hugo over the course of their relationship. She was devoted, not in the passive sense of a person who has no other options, in the active sense of a person who had examined her options and made a choice that she then honored with a consistency that remains, across the historical record, genuinely striking. She gave up her theatrical career at Hugo's request, or at his strong suggestion, which in the context of their relationship amounted to much the same thing. She lived modestly, often in rooms near wherever Hugo was staying, available when he needed her, invisible when he needed her to be invisible. She copied his manuscripts by hand, page after page, keeping his words organized when his own creative chaos would have scattered them. She traveled with him to Guernsey during the Exile years, living in a smaller house near Hauteville House, present but not publicly acknowledged in the way that a wife is acknowledged. And she wrote him letters, every day, sometimes multiple times a day, for 50 years. The letters that survive are remarkable documents. They are tender and articulate and honest about what she was asking for and what she was not receiving. She knew, throughout the relationship, that Hugo pursued other women. She said so, in the letters, with a directness that makes the modern reader uncomfortable. She stayed anyway. What Hugo gave her in return is genuinely harder to characterize. He was not indifferent to her. The evidence is clear that he cared for her, relied on her, and found in her a stability that his marriage had long since stopped providing. He wrote her letters too, though fewer, and in his private journals he described the relationship with something approaching honest appreciation. When she was seriously ill, he was present and attentive in ways that suggested real feeling. But he never married her, though he was a widower after 1868, and the legal obstacle had been removed. He never fully chose her, in the sense of organizing his life around her the way she had organized her life around him. He accepted the 50 years of devotion as something he was owed, rather than as something that cost her. This is the fact that sits at the center of Hugo's private life and refuses to be sentimentalized away. The man who would write, in Les Misérables, about characters who sacrifice everything for love, who endure every kind of loss in service of something they believe in, was himself the daily beneficiary of exactly that kind of sacrifice. He received it, he processed it, he perhaps even felt, in his way, grateful for it. He just could not quite bring himself to match it. She would spend 50 years waiting for him to choose her entirely. He never did, and yet she stayed, writing him letters, copying his pages, forgiving things that had no adequate name. The question is not why she stayed. The question, the one that hangs over everything Hugo ever wrote about love, is what he knew about himself in the moments when he accepted it. By the mid-1830s, Victor Hugo was no longer simply a literary figure. He was becoming something else, something that France did not have a precise category for, but recognized immediately when it appeared. He was becoming a public moral voice. This had not been his original orientation. The young Hugo, who had won royal prizes and celebrated the Bourbon monarchy in his early verse, was a cultural conservative with aristocratic literary instincts and no particular appetite for political controversy. His royalism in the early years was not cynical. He came by it honestly, through his mother's influence and through the cultural atmosphere of the post-Napoleonic Restoration. He believed, or thought he believed, in the France of legitimate monarchy. But the 1830s changed him. The July Revolution of 1830 replaced the reactionary Charles X with the more liberal Louis Philippe. Hugo watched it. He thought about what he had watched, and he began, gradually but then with increasing acceleration, to revise his understanding of where he stood. The poetry collections of this period track the shift. Les Feuilles d'automne, Autumn Leaves, published in 1831, was still primarily intimate, poems about childhood, memory, the passage of time, the experience of fatherhood. They were widely loved precisely because they were accessible and warm, without being politically demanding. But Les Chants du Crépuscule, Songs of Twilight, from 1835, and Les Voix intérieures, Inner Voices, from 1837, began to introduce a different register. The political world was entering the poetry. The suffering of the poor was entering the poetry. The question of what France owed its citizens who were not comfortable, who were not celebrated, who were simply living in the conditions that industrial and social inequality had created, was entering the poetry. Hugo had been walking through Paris for years with his eyes open. He had been collecting observations, documenting what he saw, building what would eventually become the notebooks known as shows of vue. And what he saw in the streets of Paris was a distance between the rhetoric of French civilization and the reality of French poverty that he could not make peace with. He accepted a peerage from King Louis Philippe in 1845, a seat in the Chamber of Peers, the upper house of the French Parliament under the constitutional monarchy. This was the establishment welcoming him fully into its centre, and Hugo accepted the welcome. He gave speeches on social questions. He advocated against the death penalty. He raised the condition of the poor as a parliamentary matter in terms that his colleagues found admirable and also slightly uncomfortable. But he was sitting in the chamber of the privileged while doing it, and the gap between his growing identification with the dispossessed and his actual social position was one that he had not yet been forced to resolve. He accepted a seat in the peerage from a king he was beginning to privately question. The man who would one day call himself the voice of the people was, for the moment, sitting comfortably in the chamber of the privileged. That comfort would not last, and the event that would end it was already approaching from a direction he could not have anticipated. On the 4th of September 1843, Victor Hugo was sitting in a café in Rochefort in southwestern France. He was travelling with Juliette Drouet. It was late morning. He ordered something, perhaps coffee, and picked up a newspaper. He was not reading it carefully. He was glancing through it, the way people glance at newspapers when they are between things. And then he saw a name. Léopoldine, his eldest daughter, 19 years old, married only 6 months earlier to Charles Vacquerie, a young man from a good family, in a ceremony that Hugo had attended with the complicated emotional mixture of a father who loves his daughter and does not fully want to release her. She had been happy. The marriage had seemed right. Villequier, where they were living, was a small town on the Seine in Normandy. The newspaper told him the rest. On the 4th of September, Léopoldine and Charles had gone out on the Seine in a small boat. The boat overturned in the current. Charles had pulled her to safety on a sandbank, but the Seine in that stretch was treacherous and the current strong. The boat overturned again. Charles's uncle, who had been with them, drowned. Then Charles. Then Léopoldine. She had gone into the water and not come out. Hugo read this in a café in Rochefort from a stranger's newspaper, not